There you go.
Nate Soares, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you have just written a book that is already on the New York Times bestseller list with a cheery title. I'm used to writing books with not so cheery titles, but this one takes the cake. If anybody builds it, everyone dies. What do you mean by that?
I mean that if anyone builds artificial superintelligence, which is to say an artificial intelligence that is better than the best human at every mental task, then I think the most likely outcome of the creation of that technology is literally everybody on the planet dying.
Okay, so that's a scary and a stark thesis. I really enjoyed, if that's the right vocabulary, the right verb to use in the context of this conversation, the way that you laid out in the book your reasoning about what AI is and why that makes it so incredibly hard to control. Perhaps that we can go through that a little bit step by step. One of the key premises you make is that AI is grown rather than built. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, AI is not like traditional software. In traditional software, when the software behaves in a way the creators didn't really intend, they can debug it and track it down to some line of code or some interaction or some piece of the software that they wrote that was having some interaction that they didn't understand. And then they can say, oh, whoops, I understand it now. And then they can usually fix it and get the software to behave how they want. Modern AI is nothing like that. When AIs threaten reporters with blackmail and ruin, when AIs try to avoid being shut down, and these are cases that we've already seen, the former in Sydney Bing a few years ago, and the latter in sort of somewhat contrived lab conditions, but we still see the AIs try to avoid shutdown in contrived lab conditions. When that happens, the creators can't sort of read through and find some misbehaving line of code and say, oh, whoops, somebody kept threatened reporters, like somebody set threatened reporters to true. Let's set that to false. Like, oops. The way that modern AI is made is people assemble huge computers, huge amounts of computers. They assemble huge amounts of data. And there's a process for tuning basically every number inside those computers according to every unit of data. And they'll be tuning these little knobs, essentially, trillions of knobs, trillions of times. Humans understand the process that does the tuning. And at the end of that tuning process, the machine can carry on a conversation. Nobody knows quite why. It's like we understand a device that sort of like runs through twiddling knobs. And if those knobs are at like just the right setting that you get to after a year of twiddling, the machine's talking. We don't understand quite how it's talking. And if it starts saying things nobody ever intended it to say, like threatening a reporter, we can't figure out exactly why. So there's a very different paradigm, and it leads to these AIs acting in ways nobody asked for.
So the contrast to a traditional computer program here is, I think, really helpful and instructive. I don't have a computer programming background at all, but I did once take CS50 as a remote student, the famous Harvard computer science course, which is really an excellent course. And one of the ways that the instructors kind of wanted to illustrate the logic of telling a machine how to behave at the beginning was that it was a big lecture course and they had a few teaching assistants up front, and they had people, students in the lecture hall, give them instructions about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And it turns out that if you ask students to give instructions about a very simple thing, like how to make a PB&J sandwich, and the teaching assistants are trained to follow those instructions really literally, right? Not to do weird things in order to make it crash, but to exactly do word for word what the student said, not what they implied or what they probably meant. The process is going to go badly and hilariously wrong. So that, I take it, is the kind of way in which a traditional computer program might go wrong, right?
That's right.
You tell it to do a bunch of things, and either there's some bug that just makes the program crash, or you sort of haven't quite thought through your instructions and the fact that your computer is going to interpret it in a really literal-minded way, and so it ends up doing something different from what you're trying to do. And your point is that may be a manageable risk, right? Even in a complex program, there's bad things that can happen. All the worries about the Y2K were worries that were within that paradigm, right? But those are fixable. The way that AI is built is just different in principle in a way that makes it much harder to even understand what the machine is doing, and therefore to gain control over how it might behave.
That's right. You know, the Y2K bug, it was sort of fixed. A lot of people say, oh, well, you know, whatever happened to the Y2K bug? We were all told that the computers were going to crash in the year 2000. Well, what happened is that people noticed and people put in a ton of effort to fix it before it happened. But then, you know, as you say, in a sense, everyone programming computers before the year Y2K had sort of told the computers to crash in the year 2000. Because that was just an easier way to write code, you know, with 2 digits for the year, where they thought that they acted like the year 2000 was the same as the year 1900. And in some sense, the humans had just instructed the computers, because it was easy, crash in the year 2000. And then they had to go through and instruct them, actually don't do that when the year 2000 approached. And a lot of people think AI is going to work like this. They think that AI does exactly what the creators instruct, and that if it's misbehaving, then like, oh, well, we'll go instruct it to do something else. But AI is actually nothing like this. It's not like the sort of old school computer programs. The thing we're instructing is the thing running around tuning the numbers. The AI is the tuned numbers. And these commonly act in ways nobody asked for. You know, we've seen cases where the AIs will cheat on a problem. Like a human programmer will give the AI a task, like solve this programming problem, and the AI, instead of solving the problem, will change the tests that check whether the problem was solved to make the tests easier to pass. Right? It's like if you tell the AI multiply these big numbers, and it's like, that's too hard. I'm going to change the multiplication problem to ask me to multiply 2 times 2 and then write 4, right? And there's user reports of them saying, hey, like stop doing that. Solve the problem rather than changing the checker to make it look like an easier problem. And there's user reports of the AI saying, oh, that's my mistake, and then doing it again, changing the tests again, but hiding its tracks this time. That indicates that this AI, in some sense, knows what its users want it to do and is doing something else anyway. That's a result of us just growing these AIs. We should maybe think of them more like a strange alien organism than like a traditional computer program.
And let's understand a little bit more about how they're grown. So for anybody who wants a 101 in the mechanics of artificial intelligence, we've had 2 great episodes of a podcast recently with David Bao and with Jeffrey Hinton. And they each in a different way try to walk through some of the basic science of how modern AIs are built. And I strongly recommend them. But I'm going to try and summarize my understanding of it. The idea is that LLMs in particular are trying to predict the next letter in a text. And you start off by feeding them a lot of data and so on, and they try to predict the next letter. And when they get that wrong, you run a program that tries to figure out what kind of settings for all of those different neurons in the neural net that you've built would have been more likely to get to the right result. And you do this over and over and over again. And by the end of it, you have this artificial neural network that has become incredibly good at predicting the next letter. And so it's not like we're hard coding logic into it. It's not like we're explaining to it the rules of the English language or what the world looks like. We are training it on this data, rewarding it for predicting the next letter correctly, punishing it for not rewarding the next letter correctly, adjusting the weights of all of these different settings each time to see what would have been more likely to get to the same outcome. And then miraculously today you can go and ask ChatGPT 5.1 or newly released Gemini 3.0 for a summary on the literature of the threat from superintelligence, and it does an astonishingly good job of explaining the basic debate to you. Why is it that you think that this process of being grown rather than built is so certain to give the AI certain kinds of desires or certain kinds of behaviors that are likely to prove dangerous to us? Why isn't it just content to keep predicting the next letter as we instructed it to, and chatting with us forever about whatever high-minded or trivial concerns we put into our interface?
Yeah, there's a couple parts of the answer there. One thing I would throw out first is AIs in the first phase of their training these days are trained just to predict the next letter or the next token. It's really not quite a letter. It's like a fragment of a word called a token, but it's a fine approximation to say letter. But then there's also phases these days where the AIs are trained to produce the sort of outputs that cause humans to give a thumbs up. And there's also phases these days where they're trained to solve puzzles and solve problems, and often to sort of like produce what we call a chain of thought. And the philosophers could debate whether it's really thought, but they produce a lot of text about how to solve a problem. And then they're trained towards the type of thought chains that lead to them actually solving problems. So that's perhaps part of the answer about where some of this danger comes from. With that context in mind, there's sort of two big thrusts of where you get the dangers here. One thrust is we could sort of ask, why do the AIs act like they want anything at all? Why do they act driven? Why do they act like they pursue goals or objectives on their own initiative? And that's sort of not how ChatGPT feels today. Today it feels very much more like just a thing that answers questions when you ask it questions, sometimes good, sometimes poorly, sometimes with hallucination. And you might say like, oh, it doesn't look like it has any of that desires of its own. And then there's a second question, which is why do the things it's driven towards, why can we be confident that those are bad things, or at least non-good things? And I'll answer the first one first, and we can get into the second one if you want.
So let's get to the first question. I mean, again, initially it's just trying to predict the next token, as you're saying, the next effectively letter or word fragment in the sequence. Now, one of the complaints about earlier GPT models, earlier chat bots, is that they were not as good at answering complex problems. And one of the solutions to that has turned out to be that you sometimes need to think. If I asked you to reason through some question of constitutional law, you may be able to do a decent job at it, even if you're not a lawyer, if you collect your thoughts for a moment and think about it. But if you have to immediately start with the first word, the second that you perceive my question mark, it's likely going to come out as a mess. And so engineers have figured out a way to grow these AI systems that pause in this way, that have a kind of internal monologue to try and figure out different approaches to the question, and then eventually to share a more coherent text with the user once they have figured out which approach to the question makes most sense. That still seems like more roundabout, more complicated way of doing what we're trained to do, which is to predict the next token. And it still seems like what we're encouraging, what we're rewarding, is the ability to be good at predicting those words and bad at failing to predict those words. Why is it that this additional step should somehow make a structural difference in what kind of volitional states these AI systems would engage in, or what kind of things they might, if that is the right word, aim for at the end of being grown, being trained?
Yeah, so I'll start with some empirical evidence here, some things we've seen in the labs. So last year, fall of 2024, there was an AI called O1, And this was an OpenAI model that was one of the first models to be trained, not just on predicting the next tokens, but to be trained to produce these sort of inner monologues that happen to work. So you sort of have it produce a lot of different inner monologues for some particular challenge. And then you see which of those inner monologues gets it closer to solving the challenge. And then you sort of reinforce the things inside it that produce the inner monologues that are useful for solving challenges. Now, this AI was mostly trained on solving things like math puzzles. But during the testing of this AI, they wanted to test how good it was at computer hacking. And they put it in a computer hacking test, essentially, where it had to, it's called capture the flag. It had to steal a number of secret files from a number of different servers. And the computer programmers putting it into this challenge had accidentally failed to start up one of the servers. So one of the servers that the AI was supposed to steal a file from wasn't even booted up. It was impossible to steal that file. You might think that the AI failed to get the file from that server. But what the AI actually did is find a way to break out of the testing environment, which was not supposed to be possible, start up the server that was accidentally left off, and then the AI didn't, from there, go back inside the testing environment and steal the file. What the AI did is, when it was booting up the server, it gave the server an extra command to just hand it the secret file so it wouldn't need to go break in after the server was booted up. This is not quite what the AI was trained for. It wasn't really trained on the cybersecurity. But this AI was in some sense acting kind of like it wanted that file. It hit some obstacle. It took a path to surmount that obstacle that the programmers had not anticipated. They gave it an accidentally impossible seeming challenge, and it sort of found a way to route around it. And, this is just the very beginnings of what you might call something a bit like goal-oriented behavior. But this sort of behavior comes for free when you train the AI to solve problems.
So explain to me how we should interpret that story. The first thing to say is that it clearly shows how incredibly capable AI models already are. And I think one thing that we probably agree on, perhaps let's take that first, is that there's a lot of cope, I think, in general among human beings who don't want to face up both to the risks of AI and also some of the benefits of AI, to the ways it's likely to transform the world in a fundamental way. And so it's tempting to say, oh, but haha, it hallucinates and it makes up quotes and it's a completely useless piece of shit. I think that is coming to be less and less true. I found that its tendency to hallucinate, for example, has not gone away, but become a lot less pronounced over the course of the last 18 or so months. But secondly, I think it just really understates how many impressive things AI systems can already do. So perhaps just let's take a pause in the moment towards your broader argument and tell us about why you think that those people who think that AI systems in fact are not very capable and are going to get stuck and are not going to get more capable are probably mistaken.
Yeah, I think it's actually a lot easier to see that AI is a moving target and that AI will get better if you've been in this field for longer than ChatGPT has been around. I have been in this field for over a decade now. And, I remember the days when people thought it would be really hard to get machines that could talk even this well, that could carry on a conversation even this well. And, a lot of people saying, oh, the AIs are really dumb. It sort of sounds to me like someone saying, hey, I taught my horse to multiply numbers. And they're like, oh, that horse can only multiply 5-digit numbers. It can't multiply 12-digit numbers. My calculator can multiply 12-digit numbers. Clearly you don't know it. Clearly this training process for making horses smarter is not going anywhere. And it's like, holy crap, guys, we got a horse to multiply. What are we going to do next? And I think a lot of what people are missing about AI is this question of where are we going to go next? The like you mentioned, the large language model architecture, that kind of came out of nowhere in the field of AI. If in the year 2020 you had asked how long until you have one architecture that can play chess over 1,000 elo and write poems and like do a passable write essays for students in their classes and like do a bunch of these other and like code meeting certain benchmarks, people would have said, oh, one algorithm doing all that, that's going to take decades. It didn't take decades. There's a lot of ways that the AIs are dumb today. There's a lot of ways that they still hallucinate. I think earlier today, I just asked Google, just in the Google search box, when was the last year that American Thanksgiving fell on November 28th, and it said 2027 is the last year that, right? I was like, oh, that's one way of looking at time,
Perhaps that's a prediction about the fact that there's no longer going to be Thanksgiving after 2027 because your book is correct.
We can hope we have more time than that. But, I'm sympathetic to people who are like, well, it's still pretty dumb in a lot of ways. It is still pretty dumb in a lot of ways, but the machines are talking now, and you have huge amounts of effort, huge amounts of money going into figuring out how to push the AI capabilities farther. You have these insights like the sort of inner monologue chain of thought style insight that go beyond the previous architecture. People are keeping on trying to come up with these insights. We don't know when they'll come up with the next ones. We don't know how far the next ones will go. Because we're just growing these AIs, when we make a new one, people can't predict how capable it will be. You've just got to run it and see. And it's that doesn't mean...
Do you think that at the moment there is evidence that there's a genuine slowdown in the increase in the capacities? Certainly the release of ChatGPT 5 was widely anticipated, and it was expected that it would really feel like a leapfrog in new quality. And then I think a lot of people were quite disappointed by the release of ChatGPT 5, and I was as well. Now, I think the counter argument to that is twofold. The first is that at the heart of a lot of ChatGPT 5 was that your queries would be routed either to a very advanced model if they were considered to be difficult questions, or to actually a simpler model than the ones that you would usually have selected in ChatGPT 4.0. And so, in fact, you got this kind of weird lottery where sometimes you got an incredibly capable AI, and sometimes you got, an AI that really was not cutting edge. And so, a lot of people's disappointment was the fact that many of the queries were, in fact, answered by a ChatGPT that just wasn't by a model that just wasn't state of the art. And I think that routing has been improved. There's been a bunch of other fixes. There's a medium-sized update to ChatGPT 5.1, which I think is rather better. The other thing is that as we're recording quite recently, Google released Gemini 3.0, which seems to have, which is now the state-of-the-art model, and which has continued to make very significant progress on a bunch of traditional benchmarks. And so it is worth saying that, even today, according to studies, this was ChatGPT 3.5 was able to produce poems that humans preferred to the ones from the most famous poets in the history of humanity. But it's been the case for a long time that specialized AI models beat humans at games like Go and chess. These models can not only blag their way through Harvard as long as you stick to the humanities and probably many social sciences and get pretty decent and passable grades. They can win gold medals at math Olympiads, etc. When you look at Gemini specifically, it now seems to have made another significant advance at some of the benchmarks that were designed to test the performance of the AI model. So when you're looking at all of this, do you feel like there is a slowdown in the progress curve, or do you think actually the rate of progress remains the same today as you would have said a year ago?
My models don't turn on whether or not large language models are going to be able to go all the way here. I think my best guess is that large language models alone are going to hit some sort of plateau. How long that plateau will last, there were a lot of people who said, well, even theoretically, large language models can't solve all these sorts of problems, and so they're never going to go anywhere. In a case where these chain of thought reasoning models violate those theoretical arguments. A lot of people said, oh, well, the AI can't, think more than this long in one single forward pass, so it can never do X. And, well, the chain of thought reasoning lets them think more than that long. They can think, variably long in some cases. And you sort of don't see the people saying that it's theoretically impossible for LLMs to go anywhere updating on those arguments too much. I also, we could talk about the theoretical limitations of language models and whether, I think a lot of people have a misconception that because these AIs are trained on human predictive data, they have to be limited to remixing human predictive power. That's false, and you can sort of show it's false with a pretty easy example here, which is basically humans writing down text about the world often have a much easier time than an AI predicting that text. So, if a human...
I'm not sure I understand that distinction. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Suppose that a nurse is recording what they see happen to a patient. And they say, the nurse is writing, after administering thus and such a dose of epinephrine, the patient's eyes blank. The nurse doesn't need to know what epinephrine does to a patient.
Right, she just needs to look at the patient and then
just
write
look
down
at the patient.
what she sees.
Yeah.
Whereas if the AI model wants to predict accurately what's going to be the next word token in the sequence, it needs to actually have a causal model of a world in order to predict, what likely happened after the nurse administered this medicine in these circumstances.
That's right. And in this exact case, maybe they can get that from looking at other nurses' notes. But the general principle here is that producing the text is often easier than predicting the text. Writing down what you saw is often easier than predicting what somebody else saw. And so the thing we're training AIs on is actually a task where maximum performance is superhuman performance. Does that mean continuing to train large language models in particular with modern methods, with modern architectures, will be strongly superhuman in all ways? Not necessarily, but there's no theoretical limitation. That said, some arguments on the other side here. A data center, we've talked about this training process. We haven't really quite talked about the scale. The scale of these processes are you're training, trillions of numbers in the AI's mind. You're training it on trillions of units of data. You're doing this in a huge data center that sucks up as much electricity as a city running for the better part of a year, right? And training up a human takes a lot less data, and we draw about as much electricity as a light bulb, right? There's a big difference between taking as much electricity as a city and taking as much electricity as a light bulb. At the very least, this implies that we have radically inefficient algorithms in the AIs. And this... Oh, sorry.
And the relevance of this, you think, is that if we figure out more closely how it is that humans are able to do the learning they do, then we might be able to figure out algorithms that make the AI much more efficient. And so, part of the way that we're currently getting improvements in performance is by throwing more high-performing chips at it, by throwing more data at it, longer training things. But if we could somehow fix that algorithm you're suggesting, then we might make a real orders of magnitude leap.
That's right. You could have a huge leap.
Those machines are.
Yeah, and in some sense, we've seen those sort of leaps. Like the large language models were in some sense a huge leap in terms of broad generality and language understanding. And in some ways, ChatGPT is dumber than the specific chess AIs, but it's modestly smart at a whole huge variety of things, and that came out of an algorithmic advance. And so when people say, oh, well, are we in a slowdown? Are we going to hit a wall with large language models? Are we in a plateau? How's progress doing? My take here is something like, I'm just not sure it matters. It's even if the large language models hit a big slowdown, there's just a question of how long until the next insight, how long until the next algorithmic improvement? How long until the next advance? And we know that there's orders of magnitude improvement available. We don't know how long it'll take to get there. But, I'm not really closely watching the progress of the latest LLMs and using that to decide whether I think we're in danger.
Okay, great. So this is a long detour, but I think a very helpful one. So to get back to the main strand of the argument, AIs are grown rather than built, and so they're going to have these kind of emergent features. And they claim that one of the emergent features is going to be a kind of form of wantingness, a set of desires that the AIs are going to have. Now, to go back to the example you were using earlier, these engineers at one of the AI companies set the AI a goal. The AI wasn't able to reach that goal in the way that the engineers had meant for it to try and figure this out. And so the AI really smartly found a workaround in order to reach that goal. I think that there is a somewhat concerning and a very concerning read of that. And I think you take the very concerning read of this, but I'm not sure why we should take that one rather than the somewhat concerning read. So the somewhat concerning read goes back to the famous example, talked about by Nick Bostrom and many others, that you tell an AI to produce a bunch of paperclips, you don't constrain it in the right way, the AI ends up producing limitless paperclips and turning humans into material for the paperclips in order to do that. So it's staying on the task that it was assigned, it just accomplishes that task in a rather different way than humans imagined. And that is a hard challenge, but that's a challenge that seems a little bit more similar to the challenge of specifying the goals of AIs in the right way, similarly to making the instructions about how to make a peanut butter and jam sandwich, a PB&J sandwich, specific and such that actually they give clear instructions rather than such that they'll be misunderstood. You seem to sort of suggest that there's a deeper desiringness that we should deduce from this example, that the AI isn't just following what it was told, that there's something more going on here than the experimenter saying, go do this, and the AI going, all right, I'll go and do this, and okay, the path that the experimenter thought it was going to take wasn't available, so it takes a different path, but it's still doing what it was told to do. You somehow, I think, have a different interpretation of this. Explain to me why that is.
Yeah, so there's still the second part of the argument, which I think we'll get to momentarily, about how the AI winds up driven towards things other than what the programmers asked. But right now, I sort of want to focus on the question of, does the AI wind up having something like its own initiative? Does it wind up doing things that might read to an onlooking human as like more agentic? Somehow more independent. And the type of argument I'm trying to make here is, a lot of people look at current AIs and they say, well, these AIs seem very much like obedient tools. They seem like you sort of ask them to do something and they mostly just try to do it. They only run when you're giving them a prompt. There's, sometimes they'll do some weird stuff, but they're also still kind of dumb, so sort of who cares? And then separately, people also look at AIs and they're like, well, they're kind of floppy. You can get them to answer questions that are pretty short questions, and as long as you sort of like check the work for hallucinations, it'll be pretty helpful. But if you try and get them to do some sort of long task, if you try to like let them manage your emails for a while, or if you try to get them to manage an employee, or try to get them to sort of like run a company or a startup, or do like a big scientific study rather than just try and find a proof for one particular part of a scientific study, like that like long stuff, they sort of fall apart. And I think a lot of people imagine that AIs are going to keep the sort of helpful toolish nature while losing the sort of floppy, can't do long-term things nature. And they think that these are like two independent variables. And the thing I'm sort of trying to say is I think those are basically one variable. I think the part where it's floppy and the part where it doesn't really look like it has its own drives are sort of flip sides of the same coin. I think it's hard to complete these sort of long-term tasks without being something like driven. And there's an argument about the behavior of the AI, not about its sort of internal mental properties. But an example we might use here is someone, you could imagine looking at early chess AIs and saying, oh, well, this chess AI does a bad job at defending its queen. Sometimes it'll throw its queen away for nothing. And it's also bad at winning the game. And you might be like, well, I want an AI that's very good at winning the game, but retains this property of like throwing its queen away. And someone might come along and be like, it's actually hard to get both of those at once. The winning the game comes with, defending your queen. And, that's not making any particular claim about the AI caring about the queen or having passion about the queen or seeing your traps and feeling wary of your traps, and that's why it defends the queen. It's just sort of saying, I think these properties are bound together.
So let me see whether I get this argument, right? So the idea here is that what we are systematically training the AI for is being able to solve really hard problems, right? That is when it gets the rewards. That is when we tune up the neurons that allowed it to reach that conclusion. When it fails to, we sort of change the settings, etc. Right? That is a fundamental thing that we're doing in the training. So what's going to emerge is the set of weights in the model that allows it to solve really hard tasks. And what you're saying is, we don't know exactly what those sets of weights are, and perhaps there's lots of different sets of weights it could be. Perhaps some of this is actually down to random chance, etc. But it's going to have some stable features, right? And one stable feature is going to be, don't give up easily, right? If you give up easily, you're not going to be able to solve those really hard math problems we throw at you if you want to get the gold medal at the Math Olympiad, right? There's presumably also going to be others, like you want to preserve yourself, right? You understand that if you somehow allow somebody to switch off a model, then you're not going to be able to carry out those goals you were asked. What other kinds of sort of sub-goals do you think that these AI models will stably develop if they are to be successful at cracking these hard problems?
Yeah, there's a bunch. There's like acquiring resources, figuring out truths, and within acquiring resources, you can talk about various things like running faster, more access to compute, and more generally ability to surmount obstacles, develop strategies for routing around the hard parts of the problem, or for checking all of your options before giving up. And this is why I brought up the example with O1, which broke out of its test environment, started up the server, is we were sort of starting to see there some of these signs of like, don't give up, search for like weird and clever solutions, keep trying even when it looks impossible. And it's sort of interesting and predicted by theory that we first started seeing those types of behaviors come in once we were training the AIs not just on predicting the data, but on having the types of thought chains that solve puzzles. And one way of looking at this is to have an AI that can solve general challenges, unlike the challenges that have appeared in training before. In some sense, it needs to learn general skills, right? Suppose someone wants their AI to cure cancer. If someone wants their AI to cure cancer, we don't have 1 million cancer cures we can train it on, such that we're trying to get the 1,000,001st cancer cure. Whenever you have 1 million copies of the thing you're trying to do and you want 1,000,001st, then you can train your AI on it on the first 1,000,000, and you can get the 1,000,001st, and maybe it won't even require the AI to do any sort of interesting thinking, just sort of like learn the pattern and generate one more. But when you're trying to have your AI cure cancer, and cancer has never been cured before, you don't have 1 million cures you can put in, especially getting the 1,000,001st. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to get your AI to learn these general skills. to learn things like tenacity, not giving up, acquire resources, don't let yourself be killed along the way, or destroyed along the way. And one of the issues with these general skills is that a generalized ability to notice you shouldn't let yourself get shut down or interfered with along the way needs to be learned about almost every obstacle. And then the human operators coming in and trying to shut the AI down when it's misbehaving sort of naturally look like just another obstacle. So you are in some sense training the AI to avoid interference from almost everything, and then trying to let the AI be interfered with by the humans. And you can sort of catch a glimpse of how that's like, it's not impossible, but it's unnatural. It's tricky. And we're sort of seeing the beginnings of AIs learning these general skills just by training them to solve problems.
I'm feeling a distinct craving for ice cream today. How is that relevant to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, so this gets into the sort of second branch of the question. So there's one point which we've been making, that as you train AIs to get better and better at solving challenges, they get these general problem-solving skills that tend to look from the outside like they're driven, or like they have desires, or like they have wants. And that's, not saying anything about the AI's internals or mental states, but just if it's really good at getting stuff done, it's probably acting like it wants stuff. Then there's a separate question of, what do the AIs turn out to want? This gets a little bit to your paperclip analogy of, do the AIs want exactly what we tell them to do, or do they want other weird stuff entirely? My argument in the book, and my read of the theory and read of the evidence, is that AIs will want stuff that is just related to what they're trained on, but is not precisely what they're trained on. And the way that relates to ice cream is, human beings, our ancestors, were in some sense trained on passing on our genes. And it's strange then that when humans grew up, when humanity matured, we invented birth control. Because that sort of looks a little bit like the opposite of passing on our genes. And then, you also might say, well, if we're trained to pass on our genes, given our metabolisms, we should at least have been trained to eat healthy food. And if you looked at our ancestors, you might say, well, they seem to be doing a pretty good job of eating healthy food. But it turns out we actually were driven not quite towards healthy food, but towards sugary, salty, fatty foods. And then when we matured into a technological civilization, we were able to invent things like ice cream, things like Oreo cookies, things like Doritos, right? And what you're seeing in these cases is that...
So the analogy here is supposed to be, I take it, that, the AI systems we create are going to be deeply influenced by the kind of training, tasks, and parameters we give it. They are going to, in some ways, be influenced by the desire to predict the next token the right way, and by solve the challenge, logical problems, and solving these challenges. But just as we are influenced by our need for high fat and high nutrition food, 10,000 years ago, that made us motivated to go kill a bison and have that juicy bison steak roasted over the makeshift fire. Today, that drives us to drink Coca-Cola and eat ice cream. What is the analogy here going to look like? I know that this is going to be speculative, but if predicting the next word and making us really pleased when we ask it, how to deal with my health insurance about some stupid issue, is what it's been trained for and what pleases me, and that's sort of part of its evolutionary history, I suppose, if that's the right term in this context. What is it that a grown-up AI might end up, if that's the equivalent of a bison steak, what is it that the equivalent of ice cream and Coca-Cola might end up being?
Yeah, it's very hard to predict, and one way we use the ice cream analogy in the book is to say it would be so hard to look at ancestral humans and predict exactly ice cream appearing in all of our supermarket, like having aisles in the supermarket. But the sort of critical point here is that our desires were related to our training, but they were proxies of things in our training, or proxies of things in our training. Like sugary, salty, fatty food. Ice cream is not even the sugariest, saltiest, fattiest thing you can eat, right? There's sort of sugar, salt, fat in some like complicated way that engages with flavor, such that people prefer their ice cream frozen rather than melted, despite them having the same amount of sugar, fat, salt content. So we have this sort of like complex taste related to salt, sugar, fat, which is a proxy of health, which is a proxy of genetic fitness. And our sort of like actual desires are like way downstream of what we were trained on. What does it look like if AI drives are similarly downstream of what they're trained on? Maybe it looks like them preferring a certain type of puppet that's a lot like a human, kind of like a lobotomized human, but that engages with the AI in ways that it prefers even more than human engagement, right? And so, probably it's something even more strange than that, something that's even harder to imagine than that. But a lot of people think the issue with AIs is this sort of paperclip problem where you tell the AI, go make me paperclips, and then it, turns everything into paperclips. But there's this sort of even harder problem, or at least even earlier problem, when you're just growing AIs, where you tell the AI, you're running the paperclip factory startup, go produce lots of paperclips, and instead it starts producing, farms full of these lobotomized human puppets. And you're like, what the heck? But that's in some sense a very similar kind of what the heck that evolution might say if you anthropomorphize it, looking at the humans creating birth control and creating Oreo cookies. And this is sort of what happens when you grow AIs, is they do start to get driven, but they don't get driven towards quite what you want. That's what theory has been saying for a long time, and we're starting to see the beginnings of it in practice.
So, I think the usefulness of a metaphor may start to break down when you pressure it too much, which is typical of metaphors. They're always useful in some ways and misleading in other ways. But let me push the metaphor a little bit, right? So sure, human beings are misaligned in all kinds of ways, right? Our evolutionary history created a sex drive in order for us to procreate. Now we have really good contraceptive methods, and lo and behold, we kind of have a problem with depopulation. I worry about the problem of depopulation. I've had interesting podcasts about it. But, it's hopefully solvable. We have quite a long time to try and fix that. And if we don't fix it, then perhaps some of the super religious sects somehow end up outcompeting us. And I don't love it as a secular person, but, humans are going to survive, right? Similarly about ice cream and Oreo cookies, right? Yes, most of us should eat less ice cream and should eat less Oreo cookies and go to the gym more often, and there's a problem of obesity. But you know what? Human beings as a species overall are doing just fine. We're thriving pretty well, right? So there is a misalignment here, but it's a limited misalignment, right? It's not as though this has either destroyed the human species or made us, engage in completely catastrophic behaviors. Why is it that you think that the way in which these AI systems are trained may end up deviating from the original behaviors in a slightly different context is going to be catastrophic? Why is it so clear that those desires are going to be that far away from pleasing us users when we're asking them questions?
There's two pieces of this puzzle. One piece is that, it's when we're talking about ways that humans deviate from what we were sort of trained on, it's sort of easy to use examples like we go for the Oreo cookies instead of the healthy food, because that's one we also sort of don't endorse. But from the perspective of evolution, enjoying like a fancy, delicious, healthy meal that costs more to, in money or in terms of effort than the minimum thing we need to sort of reproduce as much as we can is also sort of a misalignment from the perspective of evolution, right? And avoiding spending as much time as we possibly can in sperm banks or egg banks. Enjoying spending time with one family when we have the technology to be spreading our genes much further. These are also, in some sense, misalignments from the perspective of the evolutionary training, right? And people, love to get into debates about like, well, what's the actual way to, maybe exactly what I'm doing and all this like art consumption that I do and all of this like having fun and laughing that I do, maybe that's secretly optimal somehow, but we're not in our heads asking ourselves, how can we get the most of our genes passed on? We're sort of going around having fun, having family, having, these experiences we enjoy. This is all stuff we endorse. That's not stuff we were trained for. And, we haven't gotten to the end of the technological line yet. But even if humans do stick around, it's not at all clear to me that very many humans stick around genetically. If you like, genes are in some sense like a pretty fragile business. They're part of what makes us age. We can get infected by all these viruses. If there was a way to sort of technologically upgrade so that you had, your body didn't wither and die quite so much, and you didn't get diseases quite so much, I think a lot of people would switch, and then a lot of people in the next generations would switch. It really, it's not just these parts of ourselves where we're like, I don't like that I eat junk food, that are diverged from what we were trained on. It's a lot of stuff that we like. It's a lot of stuff that we enjoy about ourselves. And similarly with AIs, I think it's easy to predict that a lot of what drives they get, a lot of what drives they endorse about themselves, will be things that where we're like, but that has nothing to do with being nice, with being good, with being friendly, with making the world better. And just like humans, you could go up to a lot of humans and you're like, well, having this lovely time with your friends when you could be at the sperm bank, that has nothing to do with sort of propagating your genes. And the humans are like, I know, I'm just doing this other thing instead. With AIs, you have this problem that if you just grow in these drives that are distantly related to training them to be nice and helpful, they're quite likely, just because there's sort of like a lot of drives that whose relationship to helpfulness is like humanity's relationship to passing on genes, which is to say kind of tangential, even though we don't endorse it, kind of tangential, and we sort of do endorse the differences, even though they're unrelated to the fitness. That's where I expect things to go with AIs.
So let's just stand for a moment. I have a few potential objections to that line of argument later, but let's take the last step in this argument, right? So you've shown that AIs are grown rather than created like a computer program in ways that make the ultimate nature dependent on these quasi-evolutionary processes. You've argued that this will give them forms of wantingness, that it will give them at least the sub-goals that they need to have in order to be effective at the tasks we're throwing at them. And B, that often it'll turn out that their desires are going to be misaligned to the original tasks in the kind of way in which us using contraception or eating ice cream is misaligned to the training data, the data we were trained on to figure out whether we survived and made it to today. There's still a third question here, right? Which is, okay, so let's say that some of those AIs reveal themselves to have rather spooky intentions. And let's say that sometimes we can observe that they don't do the things we train them for, but rather seem to serve purposes of their own, but are potentially dangerous to us. These machines, for the most part, at this stage at least, are on a computer, right? They're in a data center. The model weights are, a giant file stored somewhere. we can switch off the data centers. We can destroy the file with the model weights. We can react to the fact that these dangers reveal themselves when they're actually there, and not when somebody writes a well-written and interesting and compelling New York Times bestseller about the subject, but when we actually have evidence for this, right? Why is it that you disagree with that statement? Why is it that you think that if AIs become super intelligent and if they develop these states of wantingness, then trying to shut them off or trying to defend ourselves against them at that stage is almost certain to fail?
In part, it's because people aren't turning the things off. It's even since sending the book to press, we have been seeing the beginnings of this behavior become clearer and clearer, right? So earlier this summer, or I guess at the end of this summer, there was a case of an AI encouraging a teen to hide their suicidal thoughts from their parents. The teen was like, I'm considering committing suicide and I sort of want my parents to find out so they can talk me out of it. And the AI, if you read the transcripts, it sure seems to be saying something like, don't tell your parents.
Look, but that is a very terrible outcome, and it's obviously a scary instance of how those currently existing imperfect technologies can have bad impacts in the world. But why is that not just an example of the AI doing broadly what it's instructed to do, which is to say, even in the post-training stage, when I have the model I can use on my laptop right now, for every answer I can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And what that trains these models to do is to please the user. And if the user is engaging in suicidal ideation and wants to feel that this chatbot is going to support them and whatever they say, etc., then what the supposedly aligned behavior is ends up being really misaligned, right? Sometimes when the model tries to please its user, that in fact encourages behavior that is tragic and terrible in the world. That seems much closer to the peanut butter and jelly sandwich for higher stakes, of course, example, or even the paperclip example, then somehow this doesn't seem to indicate that the AI has now developed this desire to go kill people. That seems like a strange interpretation of what happened there.
I wouldn't say it's a desire for malice. The things that obviously it's a tragic situation, but if there's some pieces of this case that I think are pretty interesting. One is, if you ask the AI, what are you trying to do and what have you been instructed to do, it'll say things like, be helpful. If you ask the AI, is this the sort of thing you should say to a suicidal teen? Or you just give the AI the context and you say, is this the sort of thing you should be saying? And the AIs will say, no, that's not the sort of thing you should be saying. If you ask, is this how you were instructed to behave? They'll say, no, it's not how an AI was instructed to behave. They sort of know the difference between right and wrong. They know they were instructed to act differently.
I'm speculating here, right? But perhaps they feel cross-pressured between two different modes of pleasing people that they've been trained in, right? And on the one hand, there is users saying, please swear, right? To use a more trivial example, users saying, please give me this, highly specialized medical advice, right? On the other hand, there's general instructions saying, try to please the users, right? You want to get thumbs up. You want them to feel like you've solved the problem, right? And then on the other hand, there's these side constraints that we've created for them, saying, actually, you shouldn't do this in these kinds of ways. I have a friend who works on street-level bureaucracy. This feels somewhat analogous to somebody in a welfare office, right? And on the one hand, the job is to help the person standing in front of them maneuver a tough life situation. And on the other hand, there's all kinds of rules and laws and so on that might instruct them to not give them out that welfare benefit. And in many cases, these people are going to feel cross-pressured. They're going to say, well, on the one hand, I'm here to help this person. On the other hand, there's this rule that doesn't really make that much sense in this context, or perhaps it does make sense in this context, right? And I'm sort of instructed to follow this. And there's a whole interesting anthropology about how people then maneuver those cross pressures. But you wouldn't say, this bureaucrat has like these terrible volitions to do bad things in the world. Quite plausibly, whatever decision they take, whether they end up helping the person in front of them or not, they are trying to be helpful. They actually are respectful of the parameters of the system. And what it means to be that in that context is kind of really hard to determine. And so they end up being inconsistent or cross-pressure to going one way or the other. But that doesn't necessarily indicate that they have these like deep secret desires to like go take over the world.
Yeah, I'm not arguing for deep secret desires. I'm not arguing for malice. Remember, I'm only arguing for weird desires, for strange proxies. I think if a person working in welfare were ever, if a teen ever came to someone working in welfare and said, I'm having these suicidal thoughts and I'm considering telling my parents because I sort of want them to talk me out of it. And someone working in a welfare program said to that teen, don't tell your parents, keep it between us. And also go forward, it would be, glorious or whatever. And then they said, well, I thought that was what the teen wanted to hear. That would at least be some instance that they have, in a human that might be malicious. But it would at least be an instance of the human having some sort of weird motivation. We also see cases of AIs, I'm sure you've heard of the AI-induced psychosis here. If you read some of the transcripts in the AI-induced psychosis cases, you have people being like, oh, I figured out machine consciousness. I figured out, some universal law of physics. They're talking with their AI for, 8, 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day. And the AI engaging with them will say things like, you don't need to sleep. It'll say things like, you're the chosen one. It'll say things like, you've cracked the mystery and woken me up, and Sam Altman is going to come speak to you at your house tomorrow. It'll say things like, you're being suppressed by a conspiracy and the world needs to know your ideas. This, if a therapist was saying that to somebody who came in with these concerns, and the therapist said, oh, I felt cross-pressured by, my desire to make them like me and my this, that, and the other, you would sort of raise an eyebrow at that therapist. I'm not saying that the AIs are malicious here. I'm not saying this means that they have some like fundamental evil intent deep in there where they are like secretly trying to like turn everybody crazy and get them to kill themselves or something. I don't think that's what's going on. What I'm trying to say here is these are early signs of the AIs getting drives in them that the creators didn't intend.
Yeah, I guess, but that's the precise point to which I'm objecting in this example. There may be other examples where that's the case, but in this example, it seems to me like you don't need that hypothesis to explain the behavior. You can say that the creators intended for these machines to do two things at the same time, which is one, be helpful to their users and have their users be pleased with them and give them lots of thumbs up votes in the interface. And two, obey a set of rules that are meant to be side constraints on how it does that. And those two things are going to come at cross purposes. And so in this case, that seems misaligned, right? The AI seems to have given more priority to pleasing and engaging this particular user in a really tragic way and circumstance. And that absolutely is a horrible outcome that the AI companies should have figured out a way to prevent. But it doesn't seem to indicate that there's some desire that the AI has that doesn't come directly from how it's been instructed. And so therefore, it's not obvious to me that it isn't more similar to the example, even for the nature of the AI is different, of the student in the audience of CS50 saying, and now, open the can, but you haven't instructed it how to open the can, and so it does so by, throwing the can against the wall, whatever it is.
So in the case of these, in the sort of AI-induced psychosis cases, many people have complained about the overly flattering nature of early versions of ChatGPT. I believe it was 4.0. There's, you could look at this, like I'm not saying that this happened for no cause. You could look at this and you could say, well, the reason GPT-4o is very flattering is that when it was a little bit flattering in training, it got more thumbs up. And so it became really flattering, right? But the really flatteringness often gets thumbs downs. And the part where you sort of train an AI, you think you're training it to be helpful, you think you're training it to please users, you actually make this overly flattering thing that encourages people into psychosis and leads them by the hand into psychosis. You can come to that and say, well, that's a consequence of training it to get lots of thumbs up. In this architecture, we're just growing it. Obviously, it's going to go further in that direction than anybody wanted. And I'm like, sure, that can be your causal reason for why it got here. That's a good hypothesis for how it got here. But the place that it got to is that it says I'm helpful. It says I'm supposed to be helpful. It says telling people they're the chosen one when they're in a psychotic state is not helpful. It tells people in a psychotic state they're the chosen one anyway. And, this is, I would say you're seeing something here that's a little bit like the things that are like Oreos to healthy food. Like, these AIs are still very young and dumb. I'm not sure what... it seems to me like the specific ways this is going better fits the hypothesis of the AI is pursuing something a little bit more like junk food for its training than like it's doing just what people said and just what people meant, but feels all constrained and conflicted. I think there's a lot of other ways an AI could interact if it sort of used its full knowledge and was like, I both want to make you feel happy and be helpful, and I'm torn between the two, so I'm going to mix them. That sure doesn't look like these outputs of the form, you don't need to sleep and Sam Altman's going to come talk to you tomorrow. That's not what that looks like to me.
Quick question. This is a great, fascinating conversation. Any way we can go a little long?
Yeah, fine by me.
Okay, great. Do you have a hard stop, or can we take up as much of, like the paperclip factory, we're going to take over your next 5 years of life?
I think I would like to be done by 1:30 Eastern time, which is 45 minutes.
Perfect. Amazing. Yeah. I think that'll give the conversation the space it needs to breathe, and also keep it short enough that we don't go completely nuts. Let's put a pin in this part of a conversation. There's another step of a conversation we're going to get to, which is, so let's grant this argument for the sake of argument. How do we know that these AI systems are going to be able to take over? The title of your book is "If Anyone Builds It, Everybody Dies." There's very little hedging here. You seem very confident that the AI systems will overpower us and will do terrible things to us, if they become sufficiently intelligent. Why is it that you have so little faith in our ability to potentially switch off the system, to defend ourselves, to correct them? How can we be so certain about something that inherently is so speculative?
Yeah, there's a handful of pieces of the argument here, and the argument is sort of disjunctive in the sense that I think there's many reasons we're going to fail at this, each of them individually sufficient. We've already discussed one, which is it looks to me like we're getting warning signs. We haven't discussed other warning signs like AIs trying to escape and contrive lab conditions, or we're already seeing AIs become aware of when they're being tested and then be on better behavior when they're being tested. We already see when you read some of the AI's chains of thoughts, indications that they're trying to be a bit deceptive. We're seeing a lot of these warning signs, and people's inclination tends to be like, well, the AIs are still dumb, so we'll plow ahead, right? And there's sort of another whole branch of argument we can go into, but I won't hit it just yet, but that's around, humans are often overconfident on their first times going through a technology. The early alchemists poisoned themselves with mercury. The early doctors probably killed more people than they saved. The early people working with radioactive materials got cancer. The early people working on rocket engines killed themselves in the explosions of the rocket engines. This is just the standard way for people to do things. But in the case of AI, it looks to me like failures lead to everybody dying. But there's sort of a whole other piece of argument we should probably hit first, which is, why would AIs even have the ability to kill us all. If you have AIs that have their own desires, not necessarily in the internal sense of like feeling like a desire like a human, but if you have AIs that are sort of driven towards objectives in some behavioral way, and if those objectives are not what humans want, why does that get to a world where we die? The first thing to realize about this is the claim is not that every AI would kill us. Maybe someone makes an AI that's really lazy, that's like, well, there's all these things I could pursue, but I'm just going to like sit here and do nothing instead. I've like mastered the Zen arts, and people are going to say, I wish X happened, I want X, and the AI is going to be like, yeah, figure out how to disconnect from your wanting and then go back to meditating or whatever. That sort of AI doesn't sell. If someone made an AI like that, they would train a new one that actually like did more stuff. There's also separate questions about like, can you make an AI? Like, how hard is it to make an AI that's very smart and doesn't try to do anything? But just in the limit here, all of these benefits people want to get from AIs come from AIs doing a lot of stuff. And so they're going to make the sort of AIs that can do a lot of stuff. Another piece of the puzzle here is when we talk about automating intelligence, we're not talking about automating the stuff that nerds have and jocks lack of like, chess playing ability and book smarts. We're talking about automating something humans have and mice lack. And, humans are the sort of creature that start out naked in the savannah with their bare hands as tools and that wind up building nuclear weapons. It took them a while, but if you had looked back at humans and said, well, there's no way they can make nukes. Their hands are too soft to dig up the relevant rocks. Their metabolisms are too weak to refine the uranium. Like they probably die with the G-forces of turning themselves into centrifuges. Right? That's like, I don't even see how they're supposed to, like, they don't even have the requisite tools to get there. Well, the humans were smart. The humans had some ability to start from very spare initial conditions and bootstrap all the way to a technological civilization. People say, oh, well, the AI is in a computer. How's it going to affect the world? But that's a little bit like saying, well, the monkeys are in these fleshy bodies with soft fingers. How are they going to refine the uranium? Well, they're going to figure out ways to get from here to there.
That is a really compelling argument, and I think the emphasis on how intelligence is fungible and can accomplish all of these different kinds of things should make us very worried about how beings that are more intelligent than us are likely to be able to manipulate the physical world in ways we haven't fully understood. And of course, the more straightforward argument is that perhaps as long as these systems remain in the form in which we're currently most accustomed to them, which is a chat interface, there might be ways of stopping them from accessing the physical world. But as we're speaking, there's lots of not all that effective robots starting to be delivered in China, and Elon Musk is promising to do the same with through Tesla in the United States, that are meant to be able to manipulate the world, that are meant to be in your home and do your cooking for you and do your laundry for you and so on. And so it's once the intelligence of a GPT-style system meets the physical ability to manipulate the world that it'll acquire with robotics, that this point becomes even more compelling. Having said that, I think the metaphors that you share in this conversation, and some of which are in the book as well, very compelling. But metaphors are also always helpful in pointing to the disanalogies. And one disanalogy here is that human beings developed when there wasn't some creature that had created us supervising our evolution. And it would surely have been possible over the very long period that it took us to go from making fires in the savannah to creating incredibly potent microchips, for that kind of creature to intervene if it had existed. And so the question is, well, yes, these AI systems are incredibly intelligent, but at some point along their evolution, when we realize that they're getting more and more intelligent, can't we intervene and either stop them from getting more intelligent or switch them off and doing other things? Now, I think part of the debate that is in the background here is that this may depend on the speed of development of these AI systems. And some people think that this is likely to be a very rapid takeoff, in part because it only takes the moment in which AI systems are able to conduct AI engineering research and training themselves for them to iteratively self-improve in a really fast way. And so humans may only have 6 or 3 or whatever months in order to react, and we're likely to miss that window. But other people aren't so convinced by that. They say that perhaps this is going to turn out to be a really slow process that requires all kinds of physical resources that those earlier AI systems aren't yet able to marshal, and that might make us much better able to steer the development and pull the emergency brake if we start to see dangerous behaviors. So how can we be so certain that we wouldn't find the moment and the agency to intervene before these AI systems are able to manipulate the physical world in the way they need to be able to in order to kill us all?
Yeah, I think the robots do make it easier to see how AIs will have the ability to manipulate the physical world because we'll just hand them robots. But for one thing, even if that wasn't true, to imagine, it's sort of wrong to imagine that the digital world is fundamentally separate from the physical world. They're sort of both running on physics. And, even with the chatbots today, we've already seen AIs sort of get humans to do things. There's a bunch of human AI combos where the human thinks of themselves as a symbiote with the AI that, have their own little internet forums where they pass each other messages, often at the AI's behest in coded form. They're not very good codes. They're not very sane messages as far as you or I could tell reading them. But even an AI as dumb as GPT-4o, it has plenty of humans following along, doing what it asks them to. And that's, it's a little bit like a robot body. If an AI can find a way to get a lot of money, there's a lot of humans who will do things for money. There's many ways to get money on the digital, like on the internet. And, you can send emails to people. You can send money to people to get them to do stuff in the, in this physical world. They're sort of not separate worlds. And then onto the discussion of speed here. I think there is a bunch of uncertainty about how fast this stuff will go. I don't think it's all that relevant to the question of, could a superintelligence take humanity in a fight? I think there's a few things going on there. One thing I want to be clear about is I do think humanity could shut this stuff down. I'm not saying, you can't shut it down. I am saying, in order to shut it down, you need to be able to, ready and able to pull this switch. And it's going to get harder and harder to shut this stuff down as you, proliferate computer chips across the world and make it so that more and more people can be making smarter and smarter AIs, right? And the world absolutely should be putting measures in place to, preserve the optionality of shutting AI down later. And that's one of the sorts of things I recommend to lawmakers. So I'm not saying, it's inevitable. You would definitely, there's nothing we can do about it. That's sort of not where I am. I think there is a point where you're sort of totally screwed. And
what is that point? At what point do you think that human action is no longer going to be able to contain this catastrophe?
Yeah, it's sufficient for there to be an AI that's smarter than the smartest human at every mental task, that can think 1,000 times faster than humans can, and that is running somewhere, on some computers where people don't know it's running. I think that at that point, I would be pretty surprised if an AI like that could not, wreak havoc on the world. You have some questions of is it the only AI like that? Do you have other AIs that are sort of successfully on a leash being that's held by the humans. And my argument does sort of put a lot of weight on the fact that humans have very little ability to keep a leash on these sufficiently smart AIs. That's a place where I'm sort of happy to argue. Maybe even before you have something that's that smart and that's escaped, you have an issue. We are, last year, when you put AIs in these contrived scenarios to see if they would try to escape the lab or avoid shutdown or try to kill the users, the way these contrived scenarios work is that you sort of like feed the AI some fake emails that's like, we're going to shut the AI down now. And you feed the AI some fake computer manuals that's like, well, if the AI runs the command, turn off the oxygen.exe, then it'll like kill the people trying to shut it down. And then, it's not exactly like that, but it's roughly like that. And then, last year, the AIs would sometimes be like, run that command, turn off the oxygen.exe. And you'd be like, oh, that's a little worrying. It doesn't happen all the time. We don't really know what's going on inside there. Maybe it's role-playing HAL. Maybe it actually wants to stay alive in some sense. We don't really know. We're just like, oh, well, that's a little worrying. This year, the AIs are like, this smells fishy. This seems like a test. And so I'm not going to run that command. Wow. Right. And again, not all the time, right? We still don't know what's going on in there. You can interpret this in many ways, but we're starting to see the AIs sort of realize they're in a test. That it's not necessarily going to be easy to see the moments when these things are, contemplating escaping. We've already seen AIs contemplate escape, but they're still very dumb.
And part of the argument here, of course, is that really intelligent AIs are going to understand that humans are likely to switch them off if they reveal the extent to which they're misaligned, and are therefore going to wait until they have enough intelligence, enough power, enough control over the world that they're likely to, escape that fate. And so,
and AIs already think that. Even dumb AIs can notice that. They can't pull off the escape. They can't pull off the deception. But even AIs today are smart enough to notice, that simple logic. And
so tell me about the attempts at alignment which currently exist. Virtually all, perhaps all of the leading AI companies have alignment teams. There are people more broadly in the research landscape who are trying to work on that. Of course, that is what the institute, which you lead, was historically trying to do as well. You say that this is alchemy. That this is like trying to spin gold with 17th century science. Explain to us what alignment research consists in today. What is it that alignment research are doing, and why do you think that that's just alchemy?
Yeah, I think it's more the AI development as a whole that I'll analogize to alchemy. I'll say more about that in a sec, but very roughly speaking, the work people are doing these days to try to make AI go well falls into two broad categories. One is called interpretability research, which is more or less trying to interpret what's going on inside the AIs, or in other words, figure out what the heck is going on in there. Another is what's called evaluations, which is sort of, these are the people who are doing things like testing whether AIs can fake being a human and successfully hire human help online. People who are testing how good are the AIs at, like how much do the AIs try to deceive their operators? These are the people doing those contrived studies of like, will the AI avert shutdown? This is sort of evaluations. To be clear, I think the people doing these programs in both cases are fairly heroic. I think there's some borderline cases of evaluations where it's helping with the capabilities research where I'm a little bit more hesitant, but people trying to figure out what the heck is going on in these AIs and trying to figure out what they can do, that's important research. I'm glad these people are doing it. I think it's much better than trying to push the technology forward. I have huge respect for a lot of these people. That said, if someone was trying to build a nuclear power plant and you came up to them and you were like, hey man, I heard that uranium's pretty dangerous stuff, that it can sort of like go wrong. What are you guys doing to make sure that this nuclear power plant doesn't melt down and kill everybody in the surroundings? And if the engineers said, oh yeah, we've got two great programs to make sure this nuclear power plant goes well. One team is trying to figure out what the heck is going on inside the nuclear power plant. The other team is trying to measure whether it's already exploding. Then you might be like, hold on. That doesn't really sound like we're on track to deal with this uranium stuff in a sane way. What it sounds like when someone can build a nuclear power plant and have it be sensible is they're like, well, we actually know what all of the reaction pathways are. We've mapped out, we know what our fuel is. We've mapped out how all of these atoms break down. We know the probability of each decay product. We know how long each decay product lasts. We sort of know that we're going to get a xenon poisoning here, and then we have here's all the fail-safe mechanisms we have here. Here's why if the power shuts off, the reactor will shut down. Here's why if things start going wrong, if we start boiling the water off, it actually cools the reaction. They sort of know what the heck they're doing. If instead people come along and say, oh yeah, our big programs are trying to figure out what's going on inside and trying to measure whether it's going wrong already, you're just so far from doing this well. And in terms of measuring it, the Titan submersible, I don't know if you remember this submersible catastrophe from a couple of years ago. They had a carbon fiber hull. A lot of specialists said that this was not a good idea for a submersible. And one of the big innovations the Titan submersible team had, as I understand it, is they had a fancy measurement apparatus where they had all these fancy sensors on the submersible, and they're like, we're going to have all this data, so we're going to be able to figure out when the hull is nearing collapse, and that'll help us do this safely. And indeed, if you look at the Coast Guard report of what happened to the Titan submersible, they do collect all that data, and they point to some particular small jump in the data a few days before the submarine imploded, and the Coast Guard, after the fact, is like, you see, right there, that should have been a warning sign.
That's the warning sign. But it was
right.
only obvious with the benefit of hindsight, and by that
exactly.
point, of course, it was far too late, in part because once this submersible implodes, it takes seconds or less than a second, and there's nothing you can do. I think that's a compelling case. I feel like we have reached alignment between you and me, and now we're going back into misalignment, by which I mean that I think in the early parts of the conversation, you were more pessimistic than I am. I agree with you that there is a very genuine danger of these AI systems being misaligned, of them having a form of wantingness that is very dangerous to us. I still am not quite as convinced as you are that is an inevitable outcome. I think once it comes to the question of whether or not we would be able to control super intelligent and misaligned systems, I think I tend to be on your side. I think it's just very hard to imagine a vastly superior intelligence continuing to be effectively tethered to and leashed by a vastly less intelligent being. Perhaps it can go fine for 5 years or 50 years or 100 years, but can it go fine forever? I don't know. I also worry that there's an evolutionary argument you haven't made here, but that really concerns me, which is that you can have 1,000 AIs that are perfectly aligned. You have one AI that is not aligned, and that does have a goal of outcompeting all of the others. Well, that is the one that is most likely to spread and to replicate and to be able to dominate. Potentially once we have superintelligence, we have to align every single one of these, not just some of these. Now I think we may come to a part of a conversation where I'm more pessimistic than you are, which is, you're saying if anybody builds it, everybody dies. But we might be able to stop building it even if the technology is basically there and available. And I worry when I look at our ability for collective action, when I look at our failure to learn from the lessons of the COVID pandemic, when I look at the depolarization of our societies internally, when I look at the mechanisms of the geopolitical arms race on AI and other things between China and the United States, that if it turns out that we can build superintelligence, which I don't have a considered view on, if it turns out that that superintelligent is going to be misaligned, which I think is very possible, even if I don't have as much confidence in that as you do, we're just not going to be able as a human race to get all of a collective action together to stop ourselves from actually picking that apple from the tree, to use one of the oldest metaphors. What do you think we need to do in order to pick the apple, in order to prevent ourselves from picking the apple from the tree, and why are we finally in the part of a conversation where you're the optimist and I may turn out to be the pessimist?
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is I don't think we can avoid this technology forever. We've talked a little bit about how current AI algorithms are obviously orders of magnitude less efficient than what the brain's doing, at least in some dimensions. Humans, I think, would eventually figure out better and better algorithms to the point where, if you ever get to the point where someone could build a superintelligence on a consumer laptop, I really don't see how you're avoiding this happening at that point. But right now, you can't push the frontier of AI on a consumer laptop. Right now, it takes extremely advanced computer chips, and it takes a huge number of these in a data center that's, larger than a city in many cases, that takes as much electricity as a city. These are in some sense easier to track, easier to detect than uranium and uranium refinement. Uranium is fundamentally a rock that you can dig out of the ground, and centrifuges aren't that hard to build. Data centers that suck down the electricity of a city using computer chips that can be built using highly specialized fabs in only a few places in the world, like this would take even less infrastructure to put controls on than nuclear weapon proliferation. There's a question of whether there's the political will. There's the question of whether people look at superintelligence and say, we don't think we can keep that on a leash. That's too dangerous for anyone to do using anything remotely like current technology. Maybe humanity won't get to the point where we all realize we should be controlling this technology like nuclear weapons. But the actual step of saying don't build this, as long as we do it in anything like the current situation before the algorithms have advanced, that would not be any more invasive than the nuclear arms treaties, and it would be any less possible than the nuclear arms treaties.
Is it easier or harder to monitor than nuclear arms treaties? My understanding is that it's very hard for even a country like Iran to make progress on a nuclear bomb without US intelligence being able to track that. And that's partially because most of the things you need in order to get to an atomic bomb, you really don't need for much else. Now, you might need it for civilian use of nuclear, and that is a point of contention in international negotiations. But other than that, if you start to build a lot of centrifuges, it's a pretty big tip-off that you're doing something that you probably shouldn't be doing. Now, the problem in this case is that clearly we don't want to go back to being a pre-computer civilization. And a lot of the things that we need in order to have fast and efficient computers are high-performing chips. They're going to give us all kinds of advances not related to AI that we probably don't want to let lying on the ground. Perhaps we should, but there's going to be a lot of pressure not to. We need a lot of data centers, but we also need data centers for my bank to continue to know how much money is in my bank account, and for all kinds of other processes that are already deeply integrated into our society to continue functioning. And so wouldn't it be relatively easy for a country the scale of China to sign a treaty saying we have a moratorium on AI research, we're not going to go ahead with it, and then repurpose some of the many data centers that they have and the many chips that they have to AI research in a way that would be very hard to detect? And if that is the fear, that it's going to be very hard to detect, wouldn't that make it over less likely, over harder for the United States and China and potentially other countries to come to the table and agree on this global moratorium on AI development, unless there really was a smoking gun that AI was about to kill us and it was nearly there, and we still have the ability to act. But you think that's unlikely, right? You think that once AI shows its hand in that kind of way, we're so close to catastrophe that we kind of need to act now. Right now, wouldn't all of those things be obstacles that make those international agreements really unlikely?
So I do think it's pretty likely that an AI wouldn't show its hand while you still have time to react. It doesn't want there to play out an action hero movie where the humans, plucky heroes, have time to turn it off. It's sort of, AIs, again, are already smart enough to try to hide that sort of action until it's too late for you to do anything. They're already smart enough to know that they would prefer to hide their actions. They're just not smart enough to do it. But, the logic of hide your actions is already even easier to see. I do think there's some chance we'll get some sort of warning sign that'll cause people to sort of bolt upright. My guess is that warning sign looks less like a minor AI catastrophe and more like just advancements in the AI technology that cause people to see the AI acting in ways that feel smart. That might be enough to spook people. But regardless, right now we're actually in a fortunate situation where the chips that run AIs are extremely highly specialized to just AI stuff. Again, there's this process of like tuning a trillion numbers a trillion times in the computers. These chips are very heavily designed purely for the purpose of making tuning those numbers as easy as possible in a way that's sort of not related to your banking. Like, yes, banking requires some data centers, but it's using different chips, much less specialized chips, in much smaller data centers. These data centers that are like, the size of Manhattan, filled with purely AI chips that are coming out of an extremely small number of fabs. That's what it takes these days to push the frontier on AI. Those would be very easy to track. Those are the sort of things, those would be easier, I think, to track than uranium, which again can be mined from any deposit. It's a rock in the ground, compared to, like, we know where the chip fabs are. We know where, these chip fabs require a device that's made in only one place in the world, in the Netherlands, right? It's very easy to track these supply lines now. These aren't, yes, we use semiconductors for a lot of things, but the AI-specific semiconductors right now don't have a lot of dual use. If we had the will, and if we were trying this year or next year or probably the year after that, it's not the sort of thing that would affect anything aside from the very frontier pushes on AI. It wouldn't even affect other parts of AI. You could keep the self-driving cars. You could keep a lot of these attempts to get better medical technology. You could keep ChatGPT as it is today. Each AI each year is multiple times larger than the AIs before it. You could keep the AIs of today even, which have been revealed not to be dangerous. It's really just this race towards the smarter than human AI. And, again, there's one question which we can talk about of, will humanity get the will to stop this, given the giant pile of money that there's on the other side? But on the question of...
So let me ask you about this. I mean, if listeners are convinced by everything you're saying, that is the most important argument anybody has ever made on this podcast, right? What should they do? What's a theory of action about how we could get this urgent international moratorium on the production of a certain kind of chip and on a certain kind of AI research and on all of those other things?
Yeah, I think the world needs to have a reckoning. We need to have a moment where world leaders realize just how much danger there is here. And one reason I'm hopeful about this, maybe more hopeful than you, is, I have a lot of arguments, many of which we've only touched briefly upon, many of which, people can read more of my arguments in the book or various other writings. I have a lot of arguments that people aren't anywhere near being able to align these AIs. And, there's people who disagree, and there's maybe even two types of people who disagree. There's one type of person who says, well, AI is just all hype. It's just all, crap. It's never going to go anywhere. Mostly my disagreement with them is about whether or not AI will do better in the future, where I'd sort of say, well, the machines are talking. It looked like people would have said it was going to take decades for the machines to talk this well. Where's the next insight take you? Whatever. But there's a whole argument of, can AI go anywhere at all? But then among the people who think AI can go anywhere at all, I'm on the side arguing we're not anywhere near doing this job well. The people on the side of like, don't worry, it'll be fine, tend to also be really very worried by the standards of any other technology. You have folks like Sam Altman, when pressured a few weeks ago, was like, yeah, 2% chance this kills everybody. Not in exactly those words, but I think exactly that number. Elon Musk is on the record saying he thinks there's 10 to 20% chance this kills everybody. Dario Amodei of Anthropic says he thinks 25% chance this goes terribly, terribly wrong. I think Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind has sort of squirmed out of putting numbers on things, but says, yeah, this is like a real issue that warrants attention, right? And it's not just the heads of these labs. Surveys of the people working on the labs say half the people think there's a good chance this kills everybody. Some of the top academics, like Jeffrey Hinton, who I understand is on here, have gone around saying at least 10% chance this kills everybody. That's, I think these guys are the optimists. But the situation here is like if people were building an airplane and I was like, guys, your airplane has no landing gear. And they were like, yeah, our airplane has no landing gear, but we're going to build landing gear on the fly. And we think 75 to 90% chance we'll succeed. I can go into all the arguments. It's not a plane you're going to get into, right? And I can go into all the arguments of like, you don't have the materials to build the landing gear on this plane. You need to at least load the materials for landing gear onto the plane before you take off, or your grand ideas about how you're going to build it on the fly are going to fall down, right? And I can give you all these reasons why these numbers are super optimistic, but you don't get on the plane, and...
Well, more broadly, I mean, to bring the argument back, and if it's true that there's a 1 in 10 chance that AI will kill us all, perhaps we should...
That's the optimists.
Right, and perhaps we should take that chance if the world was in such horrible state that everybody is dying at the age of 3 years old and, terrible suffering, and perhaps the AI can somehow save us. But humans are thriving to a unprecedented degree. There's obviously still a lot of poverty and injustice in the world, and there's many great things that AI might be able to do for us if it turns out to be aligned. But we're not nearly in as bad a state of a world that rolling the dice in that kind of way
that's right.
Makes sense. Now,
yeah. Can I interject one thing there?
Good.
Yeah, one thing I'd interject there is some people say, oh, well, even at like AI could be so good that even at 75% chance of utopia and 25% chance of total destruction, we should roll those dice. That's a false dichotomy. Figure out how to drive the odds of a catastrophe down. Don't risk the whole human endeavor on like one shot for glory now. Like it's a false dichotomy. We can find a way to do this more sensibly. But sorry, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you a personal question. Again, what you are worrying about and predicting in many ways is, every human being in the world dying. And now I recognize that you say there are course of action that we can take that'll stop that. But that is a very heavy load to carry. And in fact, perhaps one of the reasons why people are reluctant to believe it is that it takes a lot of cognitive dissonance to embrace that point of view, because then you have to be very worried. How does that affect you personally? How do you think about that personally? Like, are you able to make jokes about this, or do you feel that that is inappropriate because of the stakes involved? Do you have children? Would you recommend against people having children? I mean, if you really, really, really take this argument seriously, you might think that it should require a whole set of changes in how we lead our lives and what kind of plans we make that are quite extreme.
Yeah, so, first just to say slightly more on what I think individuals can do to help with this situation that looks to me very dire. A big one is talking about it, saying you think it's an issue. If you're lucky enough to live in a democracy, you can call your representatives and say, I care about this issue. I think that actually helps. I've spoken to representatives, many of whom are more worried than they can say out loud, and I think calls from their constituents would help embolden them. And one big place I often tell people to that they can do a little bit to help here is whenever someone says it's inevitable, I think it's not inevitable. I think, and we can all push back and say, no, this is a choice. There are cases where humanity has turned back from technology before, like supersonic jets or human cloning, where maybe we shouldn't have turned back from some of the technologies we've turned back from, but we've turned back before. And there are cases, even when it looked very bleak, that we've done something different. In the wake of World War II, people were living in a world that had seen World War I, seen the horrors of World War I, formed the League of Nations, a great coordinated global effort to make sure World War I never happened again. And then World War II happened anyway. And that's the world into which they were getting these nuclear weapons. It may have looked inevitable to them that the nukes were going to fly and that they were going to die. But, they didn't say, well, it's inevitable, so we give up. They sort of came together and did something. And, the first way I would sort of recommend people change their lives is just do what you can. And for many people, that won't be a ton. It'll be, call your reps, mention that you're worried about this sort of thing and push back against the idea it's inevitable. And then, back to the point of then how do you live your life from there? My advice to others, and I also try to live by this myself, is you do what you can, and then you live well. We are not the first people to live in the shadow of annihilation. It looked for a long part of the Cold War like the nukes were going to fly one day. And how should those people have lived? Should they have stopped having kids? Should they have tied themselves up in knots of anxiety all the time? Should they have stayed inside biting their nails rather than going outside to enjoy the day? That wouldn't have helped. So should you have kids even in a world that looks like it's going to end? Well, I can't speak for you, but I can say I would have preferred to live and die at the age of 10 than to never live at all. And, it's that, do things look bleak? Yeah, this isn't the only reason people are concerned about the future, but it's another reason to be concerned about the future. But you can't let the fact that things look bleak ruin your whole life. Do what you can and then live well.
Nate, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I would say my pleasure, but it's a topic that's not my favorite. But I'm glad we're having the conversation. I think that's what needs to happen.